I have been called many things in my life: ruthless, cold, unapproachable, the sort of man whose name clears a room before he enters it. The men of my county said the Duke of Aldenver had no heart worth speaking of, and for a long time I saw no reason to prove them wrong. I had my estate, my tenants, my obligations, and what passed for order in a world that valued order above all else. I told myself that was sufficient. I told myself, on the long evenings when Aldenver Hall fell quiet and the candlelight guttered in its sconces, that a man of my position required no more than that. Then I saw an old gray horse standing in the yard behind Carville Market, and beside him, a woman in a brown wool coat who looked as though she had not slept in 3 days. That was the beginning. Or rather, that is where I must begin, because it is the moment everything changed, though I did not understand it then. I did not understand anything of consequence that morning. I was too occupied, as powerful men so often are, with noticing the wrong things entirely. The Carville Autumn Fair was not an occasion I typically attended. My steward, a competent and long-suffering man named Pembwick, had asked me to look over a particular set of carriage horses he believed might suit the estate's second coach, and since I trusted his eye for livestock more than any dealer's word, I had agreed to ride out and settle the matter myself. It was a crisp October morning, the kind that smells of turned earth and wood smoke, and the market square was crowded in the way of country fairs, farmers in good humor, wives examining bolts of wool, children chasing one another around the haberdasher's cart. I made my way through it all with the particular quality of movement that serves a man of my height and reputation well. The crowd simply parted and did not look too directly. I found Pembwick near the horse paddock on the market's eastern edge, and we spent perhaps 20 minutes assessing the carriage pair he had identified, good strong animals, well-tempered, exactly what the estate required. The purchase was straightforward. I signed the necessary paperwork, spoke briefly with the dealer, and had begun to make my way back through the fair when I heard the laughter. It came from the direction of the rear yard, the working end of the market where farmers brought their older animals for sale or trade, where the business was less elegant and considerably more practical. A cluster of men had gathered near the fence rail, and there was in their laughter the particular note that I have always found disagreeable. Not mirth, exactly, but the sound of people amusing themselves at someone else's expense. I did not intend to stop. I am not a man who involves himself in other people's quarrels without cause. But I was walking in that direction in any case, and something in the tone of the laughter made my step slow, and I looked. The horse was indeed old. That much was simply true and no cruelty to observe. He was a gray, once I thought, probably a fine dapple, but age had washed most of the color from him and left him pale as ash and a little stiff in his near hind. He stood very quietly in the yard, his large eyes half closed in the autumn sun, entirely unbothered by the noise around him, which is itself the mark of a horse well handled and long trusted. He was perhaps 16, perhaps 17 years old. His coat was clean. That last detail is the one that arrested me, though I could not have said so in that moment. 3 men, I recognized 2 of them, minor landholders, the sort who breed more opinions than they do useful crops, were addressing themselves to the horse's owner. She stood on the far side of the animal with her hand resting lightly on his neck, and she was listening to what they said with an expression so carefully composed that it told me, at once and without question, that she had been required to practice that composure. "You'll not find a buyer for that bag of old bones," the taller of the 3 was saying, in the cheerful voice of a man who has never once considered that his cheerfulness costs anything. "He's done. What is he, 20? "He is 15, the woman said. Her voice was steady. "And sound." "Sound," the man laughed again, and his companions joined him. "Look at the tack on him, Halsworth. Look at the state of it." The other man looked and made a sound of theatrical dismay. "Good Lord, is that harness or patchwork?" I looked too, then, properly. The horse wore an old bridle and a worn leather headstall, both of which had seen considerable use. The leather was darkened with age and had been oiled and re-oiled until it shone with a patient, careful gloss, the sort of shine that only comes from regular attention, not from newness. But it was old unmistakably, and in one place along the brow band there was a repair. A strip of darker leather laced carefully over a crack, the stitches small and even and precise. Not the repair of negligence. The repair of someone who could not replace the piece and had therefore mended it properly, with skill and with care. The men found this hilarious. Or rather, they found it useful, which is a different thing entirely. They found it a convenient ledge to stand on while they looked down at someone they had decided was beneath them. The woman did not step back. She stood beside her horse with her hand on his neck, and she looked at the men with that carefully held expression, and she said nothing further. There was in her silence something that I recognized, because I have spent my own life cultivating a version of it, the decision not to give people the reaction they are hoping for. I had seen enough. I moved toward the fence. "Good morning," I said. The three men turned. I watched their faces do the thing faces do when they realize who is speaking to them, and to their credit, the laughter stopped quickly. "Your Grace," said the taller one, "we were only—" "I know what you were doing," I said pleasantly. I looked at the horse. I looked at the bridle. I looked for the second time at the mended brow band with its careful stitching. I was admiring the tack, beautifully repaired. There was a brief silence. "He is sound?" I asked the woman. She met my eyes. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair pulled back under a plain bonnet and eyes that were— I noticed this the way one notices a particular quality of light, entirely without deference. Not rude, not hostile, simply quietly present. She assessed me in a glance the way she had probably assessed every person who approached that horse that morning. Not for rank, but for whether I meant what I was saying. "Yes," she said. "He is. He favors his near hind in cold weather, but it has been that way for 4 years, and it has not worsened. He has carried me 70 miles in 2 days before now and come through it." 70 miles in 2 days, I said. "When it was necessary." There was something in those 4 words, "when it was necessary," that told me a great deal. I looked at the horse again. His eye was soft, his coat clean, his legs without swelling or heat despite standing in the October chill. Whatever circumstances had brought this woman to a country fair to sell him, she had not let those circumstances alter how she cared for him. "What is his name?" I asked. "Copper," she said. "He was copper-colored when I was a child. The name has not kept pace with him." I almost smiled. "How much are you asking?" The 3 men behind me had gone very still. She named a figure that was, I realized immediately, far too low. Not an asking price. A desperate price, the price of someone who needed the transaction to succeed today at this market, whatever the return. "That is not enough," I said. She blinked. It was the first crack in that careful composure. "I beg your pardon. The horse is worth more than that. I will give you twice what you've asked." "Your Grace," said the taller of the 3 men, finding his voice again, "the animal is quite old." I looked at him. He stopped talking. "The leather on that brow band repair," I said to the woman. "Where did you learn to stitch like that?" She looked at me steadily. "My father's harness room," she said. "He was not a wealthy man. We mended things rather than replacing them." "A useful skill," I said. "An essential one," she answered. There was a pause. The crowd around us had grown, in the quiet way of country fairs where nothing of interest happens very often, and anything of interest immediately draws an audience. I pulled my gloves off and handed them to Pembwick, who had appeared silently at my elbow in the manner of an excellent steward. "What brings you to sell him at all?" I asked. I was not certain why I was continuing the conversation. I am not by nature a man who asks questions at markets. But something kept me standing there, something in the quality of her steadiness, the careful pride of a woman who had mended her own tack because she could not afford to replace it and had never once been careless with it. She was quiet for a moment. "My father died in June," she said. "The tenancy of the farm reverted to Lord Marvell with the death of the lease. I have employment secured as a companion at Brethwick House. I begin in a fortnight. But I cannot keep a horse on a companion's wage, and I cannot take him with me, and I would rather sell him well today than badly next month." A companion, a house servant's position, though she spoke with the diction and the self-possession of a woman born to considerably more. A farmer's daughter, I thought. Not gentry, but well-educated, perhaps a father who valued books more than many of his station had reason to. "Brethwick House," I said. "Yes, Your Grace. That is 14 miles from here." "I know where it is," she said quietly. She would walk there, I understood. She had probably walked here. 14 miles each way in October, in that brown wool coat that was clean and pressed and threadbare at the cuffs. I did not think about what I said next. That is the honest account. I did not plan it, did not consider whether it was appropriate or what the watching crowd would make of it, or what Lord Marvell, who was a distant acquaintance of mine and not a man I particularly admired, would say when he heard of it. I simply said it. Aldenver has need of a horse of his experience, I said. And Aldenver also, it happens, has need of a person who can mend a brow band. I am not speaking of stable work, I have stable hands. I am speaking of the estate's library, which is in disorder, and the household correspondence, which is in worse disorder, and the general administration of a house that has been without a mistress for some years. If you are agreeable to it, I would pay you 4 times what you've named for the horse, and offer you a position at Aldenver Hall rather than Brethwick House. There was a very long silence. You don't know me, she said. I know you mend things properly, I said. In my experience, that tells you more about a person than most things you could be told directly. Her eyes held mine. My name is Miss Emmeline Croft, she said. My father was Thomas Croft of Hawthorne Farm. I know the name, I said, which was true. Thomas Croft had been a tenant on Marvell's land for 20 years, a man of honest reputation, by all accounts. My name is. I know who you are, Your Grace, she said, and there was, for just a moment, a ghost of something at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. One tends to. The laughter, when it came, was not the laughter of the 3 men. It was the small, private laughter of the crowd around us, not unkind, this time. The sound of people who are watching something they cannot quite name but recognize as true. Will you consider it? I asked. She looked at her horse. Her hand was still on his neck, and he had turned his great gray head to rest against her shoulder in the easy, familiar way of an animal that has been trusted and has learned to trust in return. If Copper comes with me, she said. Obviously, I said. He is the whole reason I know you're worth the trouble. She looked at me then, fully and directly, and I had the experience, unfamiliar to me at that point in my life, of being seen by someone who was not assessing my title or my estate or my reputation, but simply me, as I was standing there in the October chill with my gloves in my steward's hands. Yes, she said, I will consider it. That was the agreement. Tentative, unusual, probably remarked upon in every farmhouse within 5 miles of the market before nightfall. I did not, at that point, understand it as the beginning of anything. I understood it as a practical arrangement, a woman of clear competence placed where her competence could be useful in a household that needed it. I was wrong, of course, but the correction was gradual and I was slow, and by the time I understood what was happening, it was already done. Miss Croft arrived at Aldenver Hall 9 days later, having, I suspected, concluded her obligations at the farm with the same careful thoroughness she brought to everything else. She came by the carrier's cart. I learned afterward that she had walked the first 4 miles to the carrier's stop and ridden the remaining 10, and she arrived on a gray Tuesday morning with a trunk that was modest and a deportment that was not. She thanked the carrier, declined the assistance of my footman with the trunk, then thought better of it and allowed him to carry it after all, which suggested to me someone who was neither falsely proud nor genuinely helpless, but rather in the process of recalibrating what she was permitted to accept. I was in the library when Pembwick brought word that she had arrived. I had told myself I was not watching for her arrival. I was not, in fact, watching from the window. I was definitely watching from the window. Copper was already installed in the south paddock. I had told my head groom, a taciturn Northumbrian named Gatch, to put the horse wherever he would be most comfortable, and Gatch had assessed the old gray with the professional indifference of a man who has seen every variety of horse and found most of them wanting. And then I had noticed, 3 days later, that Copper's stall had been given fresh straw and a new water bucket, and that Gatch was brushing him out with considerably more attention than the animal's market value would have suggested was warranted. I took this as a good sign. Gatch's opinion of horses was generally reliable. Miss Croft began in the library. I will not pretend that I had any particular gift for administering my own household. The Aldenver Library contained some 3,000 volumes, good ones, many of them, acquired over several generations, and they had been catalogued once, inadequately, in my grandfather's time, and not significantly reorganized since. The household correspondence was managed by a secretary I employed 3 days a week, a reasonable man who was better with figures than with letters, and who had been gently overwhelmed by the sheer volume of what Aldenver generated. There were tenant accounts to reconcile, charitable subscriptions to maintain, invitations to manage, and a general air of important things nearly kept up with nearly, but not quite. Within a fortnight, the correspondence was in order. Within 3 weeks, the library had a new catalog. I found this out not because Miss Croft reported it to me, but because I went looking for a particular volume one afternoon, and found it precisely where logic dictated it should be. In a section I had not thought to look in before because the previous organization had placed it somewhere entirely illogical. And when I looked at the shelving around it, I realized that approximately 300 volumes had been quietly and correctly rehomed. I mentioned this to Pembwick. Pembwick mentioned that Miss Croft had also identified 3 lease renewals that had been sitting unsigned for longer than they ought, and had drafted the renewal letters herself on the basis of the previous correspondence, and left them on my desk for signature. I went to find her. She was in the small sitting room off the library that I had made available for her use, writing letters at the table near the window. Copper was visible from that window in the south paddock, I noticed, a fact which I was nearly certain had not escaped her when she had chosen the chair. "The lease renewals," I said. She looked up. "The tenants will need certainty before winter," she said. "I can describe my reasoning if you would prefer to rewrite them." "I read them," I said. "They don't need rewriting." She looked at me with that quality of attention she brought to everything, as though she were assessing the structural soundness of what she saw. "Is there something wrong?" she asked. "No," I said. "I came to say thank you." A pause. "Oh," she said. It seemed to surprise her. The possibility of that gratitude might surprise her, stayed with me. I began to find reasons to work in the library. This was not, I told myself, anything other than a practical decision. The library was orderly now, and I had several matters of correspondence that required attention, and it was a sensible room for the purpose. Miss Croft worked at her table, and I worked at the large desk in the center of the room, and we were both engaged in entirely legitimate activities that had nothing to do with each other, except that we spoke. At first about the work, a question about a particular tenant's history, a clarification about an estate boundary, a recommendation from her about whether a certain charitable subscription had been honored consistently enough to merit continuation. Then about other things. She had read extensively, as I discovered when I mentioned a particular volume I had been rereading, and she said, with the measured carefulness of someone who was not entirely sure how the information would be received, that she found the author's 3rd chapter rather stronger than his reputation suggested it was. I agreed. I told her so. After that, we talked about books. The household noticed. Households always notice. That is the nature of the institution. I was aware that my housekeeper, Mrs. Dunwick, a woman of exceptional competence and exceptional opinions, was watching the situation with a look she had not yet put into words. I was aware that Pembwick had adopted a particular careful neutrality on the subject of Miss Croft that was itself a kind of eloquent comment. I was aware that the 3 gentlemen from the market, one of whom had been bold enough to call upon me a week after Miss Croft's arrival, in what I could only interpret as an attempt to gauge my views on the matter, had left the meeting no clearer on the question than when they came, because I had said nothing they could use. What I felt I was less clear about. I had been without close human company for a long time. That is the plain version of it. My parents were both gone. I had no siblings. I had friends after a fashion, men I had known since boyhood, men I trusted in the ways that such trust is built, through shared history and mutual respect. But there was no one in my daily life who spoke to me the way she did, directly, without calculation, without the particular careful management that most people applied when addressing me. She simply said what she thought, and what she thought was, on the whole, worth hearing. It was December before I allowed myself to understand what was happening. The occasion was a small one. She had mentioned, in passing, that Copper seemed easier in his movements since the cold had come, that the paddock's softer ground suited him better than the market yard had. I went to see for myself one morning and found her there before me, standing at the fence in her coat, and her plain gloves with her breath making small clouds in the cold air, watching the old horse move in slow circuits around the paddock. I stood beside her at the fence. "He is easier," I said. "Yes," she said. "He always was better in mud than in hard ground. When I was small and it rained for a week, my father would say the horses were the only ones pleased about it. She paused. My father knew horses better than most things. He sounds like a man worth knowing, I said. He was, she said simply. We were quiet for a moment. The horse moved at the far end of the paddock, unhurried, his breath making its own small clouds. You chose his welfare over your own comfort, I said. In coming here rather than Brethwick. I chose copper and a position I could bear, she said. I would have been unhappy at Brethwick. I am not unhappy here. She said it plainly, as a fact to be reported, not a sentiment to be performed. And then she looked at me sideways, with the ghost of something in her expression that I was beginning to learn to read. You knew the position at Brethwick would not suit me before you offered an alternative. I did not know that, I said. You guessed it. I guessed, I allowed, that you were not born to be a companion. Most companions are not born to be companions, she said. It is the position one takes when the alternatives are closed. And are your alternatives still closed? I asked. She turned to look at me directly. In the December light, her face was very clear, the steadiness of it, the absence of pretense. I don't know, she said. I think that depends on what you mean. I did not answer immediately. I looked at the horse. The brow band, I said. When I saw it at the market, the repair, I have been thinking about it. The repair, she said carefully. It was not new leather, I said. It was a piece cut from somewhere else, from an old girth strap, I thought, from the look of the color. You made it fit. And the stitching was perfect. That does not happen by accident. That is a person who will not let things be less than they should be, even when no one is looking, even when the only one who benefits is a horse. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, I did not want him to be uncomfortable. I know, I said. I turned to face her. She did not step back. I am asking poorly, I said. I am aware that I am asking poorly. I am not practiced at asking for things I genuinely want as opposed to things I require. What do you want? She asked. I would like, I said carefully, to know whether you would be willing to remain at Aldenver in a different capacity than the one currently understood. She waited. I am aware that this is irregular, I said. I am aware that I have known you for 6 weeks and that 6 weeks is not sufficient to know a person by any reasonable standard. I'm also aware that I have spent 20 years being measured and deliberate about everything I do, and that I find at present that I do not wish to continue being measured and deliberate about this particular thing, because every time I am measured and deliberate about it, I simply arrive at the same conclusion, which is that the house is better with you in it, and that I am better when I am talking to you, and that these facts seem to me to be significant. She looked at me for a long moment. The horse had come to the fence and was standing near her shoulder with his great head over the rail in the familiar way of the well-loved. You are not asking, she said, what you think you are asking. I am asking, I said, if you would allow me to ask the larger question at a later point when you have had time to consider whether I am worth the trouble. She reached up and touched the horse's nose, a small, habitual gesture, and he blew softly against her glove. You paid 4 times what he was worth, she said, and you gave him a good paddock, and you have not once spoken to me as though I am inferior to you. You are not inferior to me, I said. Half the county thinks otherwise, she said, the half that matters to a duke. The half that matters to me, I said, is considerably smaller. It consists at the moment almost entirely of you and Pembwick and Gatch has already voted. There was a long silence. The winter light lay flat across the paddock, and the old horse stood patient at the fence, and the frost glittered in the grass, and I waited. 6 weeks is not long, she said. No, I agreed. You should know that I am not gentle about disorder, she said. I will continue to reorganize the library. I am counting on it, I said. And I will continue to tell you when I think you are wrong. That also, I said, I find I am counting on. She turned to look at me fully, with that steady, measuring quality that I had come to think of as the truest thing about her, the willingness to see what was actually there. Then I will consider it, she said. Your larger question when you ask it. Thank you, I said. She nodded once, with the precise dignity of someone who understands the weight of what has just passed between them, and will not trivialize it by speaking further. We stood at the fence for another few minutes. in silence that was entirely comfortable, watching the old horse in the gray December morning. I asked the larger question in February. I asked it badly, as I had warned her I would. I had prepared a speech, and then lost it entirely somewhere between leaving my dressing room and arriving at the sitting room door, and what came out instead was considerably shorter and considerably more honest, which was perhaps better in the end. She said yes. She said it in the same direct way she said everything, without performance, without the decorative hesitation some women were taught to provide for the sake of a man's ego. Simply yes, and then she looked at me with those quiet, present eyes and said, "I should warn you that Copper will need a warmer stable next winter. The south paddock is too exposed." I told her I would build one if required. "You needn't build one," she said. "The north stable would do with some repairs to the east wall." "Pembroke will see to it," I said. "I know where to find the lime and the good stone," she said. "It's faster if I show him." I looked at her, standing in the winter light of the sitting room in her brown dress that was not new, with that expression of absolute practical competence, and I thought, I remember this clearly, I thought, here is a person who will mend things properly, every single thing she touches. We were married in April, in the church at Aldenver Village, in a ceremony attended by the tenants and the household, and a small number of people whose good opinion I actually valued, and notably absent of the larger society event that would have been expected of a duke's wedding. I had not wanted it. She had not wanted it. Pembroke had organized everything with his usual unhurried precision, and Gatch had polished Copper's tack, the old bridle, the worn headstall, the carefully repaired brow band with its neat, even stitching, and turned him out to stand in the churchyard as though he too were part of the occasion, which I supposed he was. The 3 men from the market were not present. I am not certain they heard about the wedding before it happened. By the time it was common knowledge, the thing was done, and there was nothing to be said about it that mattered. My wife walked into the church in a pale dress that Aldenver's dressmaker had made, because I had asked quietly and she had agreed to allow it, and she carried a small arrangement of early spring flowers that she had picked herself from the garden that morning. She looked, I thought, exactly as she always looked, clear-eyed and unhurried and entirely present. She looked like herself, which was all I had ever wanted her to look like. When it was over, when the vows were said, and the register was signed, and we had walked out into the April morning together, the first thing she did was go directly to Copper, who had been standing at the churchyard wall with the patience of the very old and the very trustworthy, and give him something from her pocket, a piece of apple, I discovered later, which she had been carrying against this exact eventuality. I stood beside her and watched the horse eat his apple, and I thought of a gray October morning at a country fair, and a cracked buckle mended with a piece of old girth leather, and 3 men laughing at something they had not looked at closely enough to see. I had looked, that is all I had done in the end, looked closely enough to see what was there. It has never been the largest gestures that tell you what a person is. It has always been the small, private ones, the tack cleaned when no one required it, the stitch placed when no one was watching, the horse kept and cared for when every practical consideration argued for letting him go. In those choices, made alone and in obscurity, a character is revealed more completely than in anything that happens in a ballroom or a drawing room or any other stage that the world builds for the purpose of performance. She had passed every such test before I ever asked her a single question. I have been called many things. Ruthless I was, cold I may have been, unapproachable certainly. None of those things are entirely gone, they are simply no longer the whole of the matter. The whole of the matter in the end is this. I walked past a horse at a country market, and I looked at the tack, and I thought, there is someone here who will not let things be less than they should be, even when no one is looking. And I was right about that. I have been right about very little else with the same certainty, but about that I have never had a moment of doubt. She is at her desk now, I imagine, with the morning light coming through the sitting room window and Copper visible in the paddock below, and some piece of correspondence in her careful, steady hand. And the library is in order, and the tenants have their renewals, and the east wall of the north stable has been repaired with the good lime and the good stone, and the house is better than it has ever been. It is a great deal, I have found, to have someone who mends things properly. It is, in fact, everything,